Okay, I think we're going to get started now. I'm Debbie Liu. I'm the Associate Director of ESIG, and I wanted to welcome everyone to this special webinar. For those of you who aren't familiar with ESIG, we're a membership-based nonprofit organization, and we provide members with objective information, resources, networking opportunities to support clean energy and energy systems integration decisions. We do this through workshops, tutorials, webinars like today, blogs, working groups, task force activities, and we also produce technical resource materials. And today's webinar features the work of one of our project teams, which is looking at DER impacts on transmission. ESIG also leads one of the pillars of the Global Power System Transformation Consortium, or GPST, whose mission is to bring together key actors to catalyze a rapid clean energy transition at unprecedented scope and speed. And more information on the GPST can be found at globalpst.org. Here at ESIG, we're all gearing up for our spring technical workshop, which will be in Tucson the last week of March. Our workshops and monthly webinars are open to everyone, so please feel free to register anytime at the ESIG website at esig.energy, or you can find us on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So a few logistical matters. We're going to mute everyone's participant lines for the duration of the webinar to avoid distractions. For questions and answers, we've moved to the Slido platform, and we're asking you to go to slido.com and enter ESIG29, ESIG29 as the event code. Instructions are also here at the bottom of the screen. There's a thumbs up button next to the questions to allow you to cast a vote to help prioritize questions. And we're going to save some time at the end, so please feel free to ask your questions at Slido. So today's topic is looking at DERs and their interaction with transmission. And as you know, there's many pathways to meet future clean energy goals. Especially today, because we have a lot of distributed solar and a growing amount of distributed storage. And some people have postulated that because transmission can be difficult to site, permit, and build, that higher levels of distributed generation and storage can help fill in the gap, maybe obviate the need for transmission. And this study examines that question. If we meet clean energy goals with distributed generation and distributed storage, does it reduce or defer or maybe eliminate the need for transmission infrastructure investments? How do transmission flows change as you move from a high utility scale to a, say, high distributed resource future? Are there commonalities among the resulting transmission needs? So today, we're really excited to welcome Keegan Moyer and John Muhs of Energy Strategies to present the results of a newly released study to you. And Ryan's going to put the link to the study in the chat. Keegan Moyer is a principal at Energy Strategies. He directs transmission and market analysis there. I've been lucky to know Keegan since he ran the WEC TEPSI transmission planning processes in the West over 10 years ago, and he continues to serve as West Connect's regional Order 1000 planning project manager. John Muhs is a senior consultant at Energy Strategies, and he provides analytical support for transmission planning and energy markets. He did the heavy lifting on the modeling for this project. We're really excited to have both of them here today. Just a short reminder again, use slido.com with the event code of ESIG29 to ask your questions. And now I'm going to turn it over to Keegan.
Thanks, Debbie. So I'll continue with some sort of additional stage setting and introductory remarks. We can go to the next slide now.
John, we're not seeing your screen yet.
There it goes. So first thing here, the main purpose of the webinar is the rollout of this study. So here's just some additional information about what you'll find So first, I recommend just going to the eSig project website. We gave you the URL here. It's in the chat as well, where we've got a full report and a executive summary that we'd encourage you to review. Importantly, we're really grateful from the support and insight we received from the technical review committee as a part of this project. We had a really robust team. So many of them, I had to make their font small on this slide, but they're some of the foremost experts in this space. And so we couldn't have done this work without their input. So we're thankful to have had it during this work, and thankful for their patience with us as we've iterated and refined the modeling over the past several months. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide is just a quick overview of energy strategies in case you're wondering who I am, who John is, who we work for. So Energy Strategies is a boutique consultancy. Do a large portion of our work in the WEC region, but also work in some of the Eastern markets as well. Mostly in the electric sector within the regulatory planning and market space. We've got a list of clients and experiences with clients that kind of span all stakeholders in the industry: utilities, loads, wind and solar and renewable developers, transmission developers, and some nonprofits like eSig or organizations like eSig, as well as governmental organizations. So we take a really broad view in how we approach problems like this. And we offer those clients a pretty broad suite of modeling capabilities, analytical services, advisory services that are typically pointed at fairly nuanced questions or pretty challenging issues for our clients. And so we're thankful to have been approached by eSig to take this work on. And you can go to our website, I guess, if you want to learn more about us and other work that we do. So the next slide here is some additional context setting. And so I think it's really helpful to step back and look at the planning environment and look at kind of two big things are happening. One we don't list on this slide is that there's fairly good consensus, as Debbie mentioned, that we're likely to need pretty significant amount of transmission to continue to reliably, economically plan and decarbonize the system over the approaching 10 and 20 years. And at the same time, we're also adding, in the US, 3 to 4 plus gigawatts of distributed resources every year. So it does beg the question, how are these things related? So in the context of this study, we're talking about distributed generation resources, which for us are primarily distributed solar and storage resources that could operate amongst a wide range of tariff structures. So these resources we generally think of being located close to loads on the distribution system, not the transmission system, are generally owned by electric consumers, often serve as backup power, have not infinite storage or flexibility capabilities, and also don't always interact directly with energy markets, depending on the market paradigm in that region. So that's how we think about and model these resources within the framework of the study, which John will get into later. Go to the next slide. So in terms of what we anticipate could have happened here when we sort of framed the thesis for this, we sort of thought that, well, distributed generation resources could do one of two things. It could potentially drive the need for investment. We see that on the distribution system in some cases, where distribution circuits become overloaded because of high penetrations of distributed generation in a particular area. We also see the opposite of that. We see situations where perhaps load growth is driving the need to expand and enhance the distribution system, and distributed resources can avoid or defer some of that investment. So we were not sure to the extent that these trends that are fairly well researched and understood at the distribution level, it was unclear, and we couldn't find any prior research other than maybe 1 or 2 studies that briefly touched on the subject. How do these factors, or do these factors, translate up to the bulk power system, meaning the major transmission lines that connect regions and cities. So while we're sort of beginning to and have a fairly refined understanding of distributed resources and how they interact with the distribution system, we even have distribution hosting capability maps now that are widely available in some regions. We don't have a great idea about how distributed resources interact with the bulk power system. So that was the primary motivation for this study, and to try to look at some potential tipping points as when those answers and those impacts might change. Go to the next slide. So this reiterates some of the more specific objectives. So we were engaged by ESIG to explore this issue. So we explore really three primary questions. The first of which is, how do increasing levels of distributed generation impact high voltage transmission flows? The second is, how do those same resources defer, eliminate, or avoid, interzonal transmission projects, so bulk power projects? And also finally, is there any synergy between transmission investments driven by distributed resources versus utility scale resources? If they are driving transmission at some stage, are some of those transmission projects potentially the same? So we're really living here in this chart kind of at the confluence of the drivers of two different resource types, utility scale and distributed, and also a transmission, and exploring their interaction. Go to the next slide. So the framework that we chose for doing this, and there's a lot of ways, of course, you could have designed this study, was a zonal or kind of hub and spoke topology of the West. So we took a Western case study approach as outlined in the title of the study. And we effectively, for purposes of evaluating bulk transmission flows, assumed that the distribution system was sufficient to allow for those resources and loads to interact with the transmission system, basically without distribution transmission level congestion, right? We assume that those systems could interact. And that allowed us to basically take this zonal model and focus on the macro scale flows and the needs for transmission at this level. So there's a number of different approaches, and we talk about that at the end of the report, I think, that we could have taken, and some of the pros and cons of the different ones. So all of the conclusions we're making in this study are from this framework. Importantly, the study is not attempting to say anything about really what the relative cost of these different portfolios are. So while we're looking at sort of optimal mixes of resources over time, we're certainly not trying to assign or make any broad statements about the benefits of DERs or distributed resources relative to the benefits of remote resources. The study really is focused on assessing their relative impacts on the transmission system. So we stayed fairly focused on that scope. And then finally, these studies, it is a bit of a research exercise in that this is not, we think a lot of this work can be extended to most or all bulk power systems, but this is not, for investment decisions, and this is designed to be high level and illustrative. So we don't know necessarily if this exact analysis would apply to a specific transmission line, for instance, in a specific market. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to John, who's going to spend the balance of our time diving into the details of how we designed the study, some of the key assumptions we made, and what the critical findings were. So thanks for moving the slides, John, and I'll hand it off to you.
All right. Thanks, Keegan, and thank you again to ESIG and the TRC and all of you here today. So I'm going to just take us through, the methodology and the assumptions for this study. So I'll direct you kind of first to this top right part of this slide, which looks at the process we followed for this study. So in this study, we developed three scenarios that kind of dictate various outlooks of the future. And so we have 3 scenarios that they diverge starting in 2030. So really the goal here was to take a present day view of the system, as well as kind of a reasonable and informed look at how the system in the Western United States will evolve through about 2030. And then from there, kind of show how various futures, with various kind of expansion options look through a study horizon of 2040. So the first step we took was to kind of populate that model, scenario development and vetting, getting the model set up to handle these kinds of interactions and all of the assumptions that went into that. The main focus of our study is the second step, which is generation and transmission expansion. So the model was set up from 2030 to run a co-optimized capacity expansion. So the model is populated with candidates for both, generation of various types in those regions that were shown on the map, as well as transmission upgrades representing, increases in transfer capability between those zones or on those links. We then take the build decisions selected by our model in 2035, and we run them through kind of a more detailed 8760 hourly analysis in the year 2035. So we run that through a production cost model, and that really shows how the system would operate. And then our insights are kind of derived from a combination of the capacity expansion and the 2035 production cost model. So again, we look at 3 different futures, and I've created a table here that shows the high-level assumptions associated with the 3 futures. So we kind of assume, as I mentioned, that the Western system follows a deterministic trajectory for generation and transmission through about 2030. So these are our own input assumptions that are informed by, public data sources, EIA, and others. So all scenarios start at a 2030 reference, and notably all 3 of our scenarios were allowed to build transmission. There were, however, different constraints associated with, building out generation and storage in the scenarios that are shown in kind of the right 4 graphs or columns of this top right table. So what we did is the centralized scenario represents a status quo scenario. So in that, we actually allow the model, we hard code in a baseline trajectory of distributed generation, and we allow the model to build whatever utility scale generators and storage that it needs on top of that to meet its planning constraints. So serving load, meeting planning reserve margins, and things like that. The hybrid scenario takes that baseline distributed generation trajectory and doubles it. So it assumes that from 2030 onwards, there is a doubling of the adoption rate of distributed generators. And again, we let the model build utility scale resources on top of that in order to meet its planning constraints. The third scenario, really, as you saw probably in the previous slide, has a significantly higher amount of distributed generation, and it's meant to really represent kind of a high bookend for DGs. So what it does is the model has several distributed generation candidates across the Western system with different geographic when they produce energy, and the model is allowed to select any combination of those as well as transmission to again meet system planning constraints. So that's kind of how the scenarios are set up. The lower right graphic here shows the various types of distributed generation that we assume are included. So it's really combinations of distributed solar and distributed storage. So both standalone as paired generation and storage. We adopted a kind of unique approach to how distributed generators interact with the grid, kind of thinking back towards the slide that Keegan presented earlier about how, today a lot of these distributed generators don't really operate with, consideration to the needs of the system. And we tried to, represent that to a certain degree in this model. So, for example, if we have a, distributed solar unit, it just produces solar. It does not, there's no way that it can change its operation except for curtailing that power, which we did allow. We did allow curtailment. However, with paired resources and standalone batteries, we also didn't just want them to, optimally dispatch along with utility scale resources in these. So what we did was kind of set up a framework to represent the tariff rate and the impacts that might have on battery dispatch. So basically what that does is we include time of day price modifiers that kind of incentivize different resources to dispatch at different times, kind of not optimally to the system, perhaps. So just kind of going back, a few more things to consider before we look at the results here. These are a few more kind of assumptions included in the capacity expansion. So again, both generation and transmission candidates were included as future options. Part of our outlook in building the 2030 reference included a set of planned transmission projects, and these were included in all of the study scenarios. So those are shown on the map here on the right. These are kind of near-term, more certain projects that we implemented them into a zonal model and kind of included their additional transfer capability into the system. We also included a planning reserve margin for system planning regions. And we also did other things like, accounting for seasonal D-rates, resource types in that. So one thing that we did, this approach, the study does use a kind of firm capacity ELCC approach to meeting planning reserve margins. So, you don't assume that solar generator full nameplate capacity, for example, contributes towards a, planning reserve margin. So we have, reductions or ELCCs associated with that. And we did implement a framework for resources that are selected by the model, whereby those ELCCs will degrade over time, with respect to penetration. So what that does is incentivize the model to select resources in diverse locations where there isn't a bunch of other coincident generation. We also included a renewable portfolio standard constraint into the system. You'll note that most of the RPSs in the West are at a state level, and the zones in our model don't really fit perfectly into that. So what we ended up doing was implementing a single West-wide clean energy constraint that basically takes the system from where it is today in terms of the percentage of load served by clean energy, and forces the model to reduce that over time through 2040. Finally, as part of this effort, we did update all the capital costs in the model consistent with NREL ATB 2023. And they do reflect the Inflation Reduction Act investment tax credit. For load, we scaled the loads in the model. So there is an hourly load forecast that we started with, looking out into the future. And we used NREL electrification futures scenarios to inform how those profiles might change in the future given electrification. So obviously there's a wide range of electrification assumptions that you could consider. So for this study, we assumed a moderate advancement, medium adoption electrification, and we created a set of scalars based on the month and the hour. So that's a 12 by 24 that represents, kind of how loads would scale from 2023 through an electrified 2035 future and beyond. And so that loads do, assume a moderate level of electrification. And so, how that bared out in 2035 is that the peak loads in our study grew by about 30% relative to what they would have without considering electrification, and energy content of load increased by about 12%. Additionally, another reason why we ran the 2035 production cost model is that we wanted to include operating reserve in that dispatch to make sure that whatever build out that our model is suggesting in the capacity expansion works in hour-to-hour operations where you're holding reserves, backup reserves for operating contingencies. And so in our short-term model, we include regulation reserves and spinning reserves that are held at a reserve sharing group footprint. So now I'll take us into the results of the model. And so this table shows kind of just some high level information that is, demonstrative of the findings of our study. So again, for the three scenarios, we have the centralized scenario on the left. Again, that's a status quo scenario. The hybrid scenario represents an accelerated adoption of distributed generation in the future, and then the distributed scenario is a high DG bookend. So what I'll do first is compare the centralized and hybrid scenarios. So the first row, we look at the zonal transmission expansion candidates. So these are, of those 80 or so candidates that the model had available to it, what did it select? And so when we look between the centralized and hybrid scenario, we see that there were 11 projects built in centralized, 8 in the hybrid scenario, with a significantly higher amount of gigawatt miles in the centralized. So we see a reduction of the transmission that got selected when we doubled the trajectory of distributed generation. The second row shows generator nameplate capacity. That's roughly the same. The centralized scenario did build slightly higher, but another main point is that the third row here shows the total storage capacity. And in addition to adding that distributed generation, we had a significantly higher storage capacity in the hybrid scenario, about 30% higher. However, if you kind of compare those scenarios to the distributed scenario, which is again that high DG bookend, we really saw a significant increase in the amount of storage that the model had to include. It did have to include some long duration storage, as well as almost doubling of the transmission gigawatt miles relative to the other two scenarios. And so I'll kind of get back to this later, but the thesis that we kind of take away from these results, firstly, is that at moderate levels, distributed generation and storage, can replace some amount of this, bulk power transmission. It does require storage. However, if you kind of take that significantly further, however, if you try to decarbonize with, distributed resources too much, both transmission and storage needs skyrocket. So here I'm showing the generator and battery buildouts over time for the three scenarios. So you'll notice that some of the same trends exist that I discussed earlier. So there is, higher amounts of storage in the hybrid and distributed scenarios. Between the centralized and hybrid case, there does seem to be, a trade-off there between wind and PV. So it looks like, the centralized case prefers wind because it's a resource that has the potential to generate in hours, outside of daylight hours. Whereas in the hybrid scenario, when we have, more storage, it looks like that the system is, slightly more inclined to install PV. So there is kind of a trade-off there. And then if you compare those two again to this distributed case, we see significantly higher amounts of storage and the generation that were required to serve load. This slide shows the transmission, zonal transmission lines that were selected by the model. So what the model is doing when it selects transmission is that allows the model to provide more cost-effective dispatch across regions. It allows sharing of firm capacity. So if you have excess, firm capacity in one region and there is space on a line, it's assumed that you can transfer that capacity to a neighboring planning region. And it also helps facilitate the reducing curtailment of renewables. And so you'll notice here, if you take a look, you can kind of see what the model selected, and you'll notice that the centralized and hybrid scenarios are very similar. In fact, when you look at the details, the hybrid scenario actually builds 8 of the lines that are also in the centralized. And another way of putting that is that it's deferring 3 of the 11 transmission projects built in the centralized scenario. So very similar transmission builds between the two. When you double the DG adoption assumed in the hybrid model, you are able to defer 3 of those 11 transmission projects. And then when you look over at the distributed case, we see significantly higher gigawatt miles of transmission. And this, is really, the model is building these to better facilitate the transfer of power between regions with geographic diversity. This slide shows the energy served by generation type in our 2035 production cost models. So we see that in all of these cases, the Western system is able to reach significant penetrations of clean energy. And that's really due to kind of the, diverse generation geography that we have here in the West. And it's also enabled by the planned transmission builds that we include in that reference. You'll notice that in the centralized and hybrid scenario, we're serving 3 to 4% of load with the distributed resources. And in the distributed case, we're hitting about 1/5 of energy, or 21%. So 21% of energy of load in the distributed case is served by distributed resources. And then if we kind of compare natural gas, you'll see it's roughly the same for the centralized and hybrid cases. It's actually slightly lower for the hybrid case, but natural gas generation does go up slightly in the distributed case. And so that's really because the system in that distributed case is relying more on gas, wind, and storage to serve load in those non-daylight hours. So here are the dispatch. Here's the dispatch curves. I've included two here. So this is the day where the WEC system reaches its maximum load. And you can kind of see what the model is, how the model is serving load. So the black line, the black dotted line going over the top shows the system load, and that's system gross load. And then the shades of color represent the generation stack. So you'll notice again that the centralized and hybrid case really end up depending on wind and gas in the evening. And then in the distributed case, we're building much more storage. So it's actually allowing that, it's going through that a daily cycle where we're allowing more solar to be generated to charge batteries, and then allowing the batteries to discharge over the course of the evening and then overnight as well. If you look at a day with a lower amount of load, you'll see, significant amounts of curtailment. So overall, our scenarios exhibited about 2 to 5% of renewable energy curtailment in our 2035 production cost models. Largely the same kind of dynamics, dispatch dynamics occurring in those days as well. And you'll see, more wind making it out onto the system in all of the scenarios. At least a higher percentage of the energy being served is from wind on those lower load days. So I'll take us through our study findings, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So the first thing that we kind of set out to answer is, in aggregate, do these distributed generators have the capability to impact zonal transmission flows? And we found out, yes, absolutely. So when you put these distributed resources into the system with a certain limitation on when they can produce power and how much of that power can be stored, and you assume that there's no issues in the distribution system getting that power kind of to the bulk system, it absolutely does change the ways in which transmission, power flows across the transmission system. So it shifts the generation dispatch and has kind of corresponding impact on the different zones as that power is moved from where it's generated to where it's needed. And you do see that the system does rely on kind of transfers according to geographic diversity in those scenarios. So at moderate levels, distributed generation adoption could cause certain interzonal transmission investments to be delayed or avoided. And we're really kind of hearkening back to the table we showed here, where we increased the DG adoption rate from 2031 onwards, and we see that there's a reduced investment by the model in these zonal transmission lines. So we saw about a 30% reduction there. If we look at the kind of commonality of transmission investments between scenarios, we noted that the centralized and the hybrid scenarios shared many common interzonal transmission investments. So again, 8 of those candidates that were selected in the hybrid scenario were also selected in the centralized scenario. They were selected in many cases in different years. So there were instances where the model built the same transmission line earlier or later in the same year. And so it's not just so straightforward to say that 3 were avoided. There were other changes in there as well. High levels of distributed generation could increase the need for interzonal transmission investment. So while, significant amounts of transmission are required in all 3 study scenarios, the transmission built in the distributed scenario was almost double that of the centralized as measured by gigawatt miles. So, it seems like that the model is building longer lines to help transport high levels of solar and balance the system between regions where existing interzonal capacity is limited. The distributed scenario also required more than 4 times the storage capacity of the centralized scenarios, even though these 2 scenarios met the same planning and policy requirements over the study horizon. So the takeaways from this study is, again, kind of with moderate levels of distributed generation, we find that transmission investments can be reduced and more storage is required. More solar and less wind gets built, and there are slight benefits in production costs and CO2 emissions. Again, when you add that additional distributed generation in the hybrid case, and it shows kind of a competition between transmission and storage. So really, in getting that solar power out onto the system, you can either store it for later or ship it to another place to be consumed at any given time. And so those 2 dynamics kind of compete with one another in terms of cost effectiveness. At high levels of distributed generation, transmission, storage, and generation investments all increase significantly. And we've kind of already gone over that. There are common transmission builds in the centralized and hybrid scenarios, which could be a starting point for no regrets paths. So there, it looks like the system wasn't incredibly sensitive to, how much was built, how much distributed generation was built in the hybrid case relative to that centralized case. So there could be, some transmission built that, could kind of suffice for many of those different futures. The need for transmission is sensitive to many other factors, however, including time, location, capacity, and participation behavior of distributed generation. So we identified a few opportunities for future research that I've shown here. And so there's, there may be an optimal kind of combination of distributed and utility scale resources, but we didn't attempt to find that here. So there could be studies in the future that consider additional, numbers of scenarios with varying levels of distributed generation that try to assess this, find kind of the best or least cost solution. Additional studies on distribution system impacts are required for a better understanding of system benefits and impacts. And then finally, location-specific nodal analyses should be performed to better understand the relationships explored in this study. So with that, I think I'll open it up to either any comments by Keegan or any questions from the group. Thank you.
Keegan, did you want to add anything before we go into the Q&A?
No, I don't feel like I need to add anything. I think we've got plenty of questions, so I want to make sure we have some time to work through those. I just point to the, my final takeaway with all this, and I think this was in there, is that one of the big things that we've been thinking about is almost every assessment we do today points towards how important diversity is in terms of the technology, the location of resources, And I'm not going to guarantee that's true on every system and every scenario, but I think this is probably yet another data point pointing in that direction, is that when we get to linear or singular with our resource choices or our planning approaches, we see inefficiencies. And so this is not the first time that's shown up in the industry. So I think that theme is kind of embedded throughout this work. And I just want to point that out once more. So thanks for getting through all that, John, and so efficiently. Debbie, I'll turn it over to you to moderate the questions.
All right, thanks so much, John and Keegan. So there's a lot of questions. I think I'm going to start with the clarification questions first. So why do you use DGR instead of DER in your terminology? Are DGR and DER the same things? Is there some nuance?
So we used the term DGR to kind of specify more closely what we're assuming. So since we're only assuming distributed solar and distributed storage, we didn't want to label that as distributed energy resources, because that has a kind of a wider, there are other, demand side services and programs associated in that label. So we wanted to try to more accurately define what we were assuming were the DGs considered in this study.
Thanks. How are the distributed batteries being dispatched? So I think that goes back to the different types of dispatch strategies that you have. They want to know the algorithm that you're using. And of course you had, remember, I think it's like 6 different kinds on slide 11 of maybe slide 12.
Yeah, I can
Go
pull
back
that up.
to show the profiles.
Okay. Yeah, so we modeled distributed generation and storage as generators in the model. So they are, at the end of the day, a part of a big, mix of resources that are dispatched optimally to meet kind of a cost minimization objective. So if you just stick a, solar and a battery, or let's just take a battery alone. If you stick a battery in the model, it's going to charge when prices are low, hold that power, and then discharge price when prices are high. And so at the core level, that's what's going on here. And the system is going through an hourly, hour-to-hour chronology to represent that. And that's how the battery chooses to dispatch, is based on what other generators, how they dispatch. And so, if you are relying on a bunch of, fuel intensive resources, in a given hour, the price of electricity in that hour would be high. And so that would be a good hour for the battery to choose to discharge its power out into the system. So at a basic level, that's what's going on. And then however, we also wanted to kind of represent the fact that many of these batteries, although this power does, work its way into the dispatch at large, they don't operate subject to, prices of energy markets on the bulk power system. They're operating based on the needs of the consumers, on site, or other things like that. So what we did was this kind of dispatch driver representative profile shows basically how roughly we went about, augmenting the prices at which the battery would choose to charge or discharge every day.
Great, thanks, John. How are the transmission build-outs determined? Was there a predefined set, or could Plexos generate a project?
So I'll answer this by stating there's kind of 2 sets. So there's what we assumed was planned transmission, and that was all hard-coded into the model. So I think I showed that in a map here. So these were all hard coded into the model based on an expected in-service date. For models that are, there's a whole nother set of about 80 resource candidates that the model could choose from. So these are expansion transmission projects. And what we did was, again, we run this algorithm that where the model tries to select the set of resources, they can be either generation or transmission, to minimize its operational cost. So, you could invest a ton of capital cost and decrease your operational costs a lot, or you could not invest in anything and your operational costs may go up over time. So the model seeks to find kind of a sweet spot in between there. And transmission is one of the options that it has available to do that in the capacity expansion. So for this particular study, we defined about 3 options between each of these zones where existing zonal lines exist, a combination of reconductoring solutions and new build solutions. And the model will select those candidates based on their ability to help it minimize its overall cost.
Great, thanks, John. I'm going to try again to just stick to the clarification questions at first. How are the distributed PV and storage resources distributed across the system?
That's a great question. So in the centralized and hybrid cases, the location as well as the capacities of distributed generators were informed by NREL, I think NREL standard scenarios. So those are NREL futures that look at at a state level what the projected nameplate capacity of distributed generators will be. So that's done at a state level, and we took those state levels and we disaggregated those to the zones in this model. So it's consistent with the NREL standard scenarios in terms of both capacity and location. In the distributed case, however, it's again, that scenario is kind of different because we're forcing the model to build distributed generation resources to meet its system planning needs over the long term, serving load, etc. And so in that scenario, the model has the freedom to be able to select distributed resources wherever the costs are cheapest, basically. And there's also that dynamic that I mentioned earlier, where the model is incentivized to build resources in diverse locations because it can get a higher firm capacity contribution in areas where the penetration of solar, distributed solar, for example, is not as high. So it builds them across WEC, still across the Western system in that study, but the relative build locations are different in the distributed scenario.
Right, thanks. Okay, there's a couple questions here about the distributed scenario. Basically, it's a counterintuitive result to some folks that a high distributed scenario increases the need for transmission, storage, and generation. Why is curtailing and distributed generation plus no extra build more cost effective? And another person's asking, why does it build so much more transmission in terms of gigawatt miles, but not in terms of projects? Can you explain a bit more about what is happening in the distributed scenario?
Yeah, so I think the core of the issue that we chalk it up to really is there's only so much of a certain I guess inflexible resource or limited diversity resource that can be integrated into the system to serve load for 24 hours that really, after a while, you kind of hit a limit as to how much that can impact and how beneficial that is. So power has to be, generation on the system has to equal demand at every given moment in the system. And so really, I think a lot of what we're seeing there, specifically the high amount of storage, is really the model saying, my only option is to build this, distributed solar generation. And in order to capture that power and use it when I need it to serve load, I have to build storage. I can either store that power or I can transfer that power to my neighbor and have it consumed there. And so that's what we're seeing. That explains the higher amounts of storage. And then in terms of the transmission, my explanation of the higher gigawatt miles is that the model may be seeking a solution where it's transferring, power based on the most geographic diversity. So if it can get power that's, where solar is still producing in one part of the grid and transfer that power to other areas of the grid, that's going to be perhaps more beneficial than storing and using it later in the same area. So that's my kind of explanation as to why we're seeing those transmission lines, those longer transmission lines get built in the system. Yeah, I think that's about it.
Great, thanks. Let's see, someone else is asking about electric vehicle adoption. What did you assume, and how are higher electric vehicle adoption change the results?
Yeah, so for that, I will say they were included in the electrification future. So the the medium adoption scenario does include some assumptions around EV adoption, and so I would just point the audience member to that future to see what the EV adoption was consistent with it in that scenario.
All right, and EV adoption is consistent across all three scenarios. So.
Correct.
For the Western system dispatch, how did you calculate that? Why is the load much different for the distribution scenario? So that's slide 21. The load is much higher in the distributed scenario. So how did you calculate this dispatch?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the black line here actually includes battery charging. So battery charging might get netted into that black line there. So it's basically showing that to the extent the distributed case is different than the hybrid or centralized case, it's showing kind of that extra amount, that incremental amount of solar to battery charging that's occurring in that scenario. But great question.
Thanks. What was the total system cost in each of the scenarios?
So we are not. So I think based on kind of the limitations of the study, specifically around, there are costs. There are likely costs on distribution and transmission systems that are not going to be represented in this study. So, if you look in the report, there are a number of different metrics. We did include the production costs of the three scenarios in this 2035 model. So you can take a look at those. In that, I'll just give a primer. The hybrid is slightly lower than the centralized, and the distributed is significantly higher. However, we kind of shied away from trying to present total costs in this study just because of some of the limitations inherent with how we chose to set it up and the scope and focus of the study.
Right, because if we showed total costs, it would not reflect costs or benefits on the distribution system, which we know DERs have, and so it wouldn't really be a fair comparison to show that. I'm realizing that we're up against time. There's still a lot of other questions. Do you guys have a few more moments, or no? We can wrap it up or answer a few more questions. Up to you.
I have time.
Okay, great. Was consideration given to the impact on system voltages, particularly for the hybrid and distributed scenarios? All right, I'm not completely understanding what they mean, whether they mean impact on voltage on the distribution system, which we did not look at, or if they're looking at what level.
I think they mean like voltage instability, maybe, and other reliability issues. And I could just say the answer is no. You know, we sort of assumed the infrastructure was built and managed in a way to be reliable.
Great, thanks. Why was the DGR adoption rate in the hybrid scenario not chosen at 50% of the distributed scenario? It seems like that would have been more insightful than choosing twice the centralized rate.
That's a great question. So that was the original scope of the study.
We did that.
Yeah, we actually did that at one point. There came a time where we were having some kind of model issues partway through the study, that where we decided that it might, we thought it was coming from the super high distributed generation in the system, and so we changed the hybrid scenario to be more similar to the centralized scenario, so more consistent with kind of NREL futures. However, absolutely, I think that's one of the parts of future work that we think would be necessary, right? Is to kind of explore those different DG adoption levels, in between what we looked at in this study, right? There's a whole range of potential futures out here that could be explored.
Right.
Yeah, I'll just add really quickly, John, that I think we felt that, we didn't have the scope to iterate between all those. And I think we felt that at that 50% level, we were basically getting outcomes that were much like the distributed outcome, right? And so we felt like we had almost two bookends on the same side, whereas the doubling of forecasted distribution penetration is still an aggressive view of the future. It's not as aggressive, obviously, as only DG, but it is still aggressive. So that led us to where we were. We thought we were closer to getting kind of a better indication of steps along that pathway.
Great, thanks, Keegan. During a winter peaking scenario, what does a distributed scenario profile look like? And does winter forecasting include electric heat pump forecasts? So the electric heat pumps are the same for all of them.
Yeah, so the electric heat pumps are going to be, to the extent that, NRail included those, which I'm pretty sure they did. The impact of how those would change, hour to hour load, will be reflected in our curve. So like this December curve here would show kind of that, winter peaking load profile here. And so, all I think I can really say is that the model, if you look at the min and max load day dispatches that we showed earlier, it's really building enough solar to hit that max load day. And so I guess my answer would be it is overbuilt probably, or it has surplus generation that gets curtailed in instances and hours where that load isn't so high. So it does meet and serve load in every hour of the 2035 study year. So we could look at what that is in December. We don't have that graphic here, but that's kind of roughly what's going on.
All right, thanks. The distributed scenario shows a slight increase of gas production over the hybrid scenario, particularly dispatched at the onset of the peak load curve. Why is that? That you're needing gas in the distributed scenario?
So I guess just looking here, again, the amount of energy consumed on the grid must equal the amount of energy generated on the grid, plus losses, for every hour during the simulation. And so to the extent that solar can be stored in the distributed case, it is, and that is used, that is discharged, that stored energy is discharged later in the day. But there still seems to be a significant kind of penetration or amount that natural gas or some other dispatchable resource potentially. But in our study, natural gas is used to serve load.
Great, thanks. So what does the model do if you let it choose between distributed and utility scale renewable build out? It doesn't seem to be included in the scenarios. Why?
That's right. So that was by design. We didn't want to set up a scenario where those two were competing. That's largely, I think, just because we didn't feel like maybe the capital cost inputs were relatively accurate enough to inform what we should do. So I will say I think we kind of came to the conclusion, however, Keegan, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think we came to the conclusion that there's probably not a huge difference between utility scale and distributed in terms of the dynamics that we're seeing here. Well, there may be other, I guess, benefits to the utility scale than distributed, namely that the utility tracks them a little closer and has closer ability to curtail them at any given time. But the relative, the resources were not included as candidates in the same simulation.
Yeah, the reason we didn't set it up to kind of compete and optimize between the two is we didn't feel like we had a fair WEC-wide ability to account for, particularly on the distribution type resources, their benefits. So in some markets, like in California, there's data points, frankly, that we could have used and adopted to augment the representation of the net cost of distributed resources, and we could have modeled a market like that, or maybe within a given utility service territory even. But across the entire system, we just felt that there's not consistent enough data on avoided or deferred distribution upgrades or other benefits on the distribution system that we could account to that type of resource. So we didn't feel like the study would be sort of fair, frankly, had we had those two compete, given the purpose of all this work.
Right, that's a good point, and certainly a need for research in that area. So I think we're 10 minutes over. We're going to need to wrap it up. I really want to thank you, Keegan and John, for your hard work on the modeling and the analysis. An email is going to go out to all the participants. Once the video files have been posted, we'll answer questions we didn't get to. We'll post everything as soon as we can. You'll all get the presentations. We appreciate your engagement. Look forward to seeing everyone again. maybe at the spring workshop, March 25th in Tucson, or on Monday, we're doing a joint ESIG GPST webinar by the Australian system operator AMO on evaluating major contingencies. Another webinar by Hannes Pfeifenberger on March 19th on HVDC transmission planning. Further information on everything is at esig.energy. So with that, Keegan, John, thank you once again. Really timely, informative webinar. Thanks to all the participants for their interest, and see you again in the near future.